Welcome, everybody, to the World Discord podcast. My name is Brian Endless.
And I'm Joel Ostro.
How you doing today, Joel?
I'm here. We're recording earlier than
then,
normal,
that's exciting.
So I'm working on it.
That's exciting. So today we are going to a topic that's been in the news, but that most people know almost nothing about. We know there are human rights violations in China. One of the biggest one is the Uyghur crisis. The Uyghur people in Western China are a Muslim ethnic group. They're in the East Turkmenistan region. And what we know is the Chinese are eliminating and torturing and harassing Uyghurs in the name of a fight against terrorism since the early 2000s. There have been accusations of genocide against the Chinese government, killings, disappearances, removal of religion and culture, mass arbitrary detention, torture, sexual assault, forced labor, forced suppression of birth rates, children taken from their parents, just a horrific situation. A recent report says that some village birth rates are down 80 to 95%. Many governments in the West, including the U.S. State Department, have labeled this as genocide, and many others have called it crimes against humanity. Joel and I have a guest today who he'll introduce and give us some in-depth perspective on the topic. Joel, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. And I'll mention that we discuss issues like the difference between war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the various international institutions in our previous episode. So take a listen to that. So this discussion of the Uyghur situation in China is a nice follow-up to that last episode. And we're very fortunate to be joined by Olivia Enos, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Do I have that right, Olivia?
That's correct.
And has done extensive research on around the Asia region. She's written about Myanmar and the Rohingya situation before, and is currently working on a study about the Uyghur, the genocide against the Uyghurs, which we'll want to hear about that research. But if you don't mind, if you could kick us off with just set the stage. What is a Uyghur? What is this region? How does it connect to China? And why is we'll get into why is the government of China so hell bent on the violence in this region?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joel and Brian, for having me on today to discuss a topic that, as you led off with, Brian, it's under discussed, it's not understood in its fullness. And so I think this podcast is definitely merited. Joel, I was so glad that you asked, who are the Uyghur people? Because I think so often when we hear the word Uyghur, it sounds foreign, it sounds far away, it's all the way in China. And so we forget that these are mothers and fathers, these are brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, friends and neighbors. And they are facing the utmost persecution at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party simply for being Uyghur Muslim. The CCP has truly defined them as one of the greatest threats to their foreign policy core interests, which is just absolutely mind-blowing when you, at least for me, I have so many Uyghur friends. They're peaceful people. They care very deeply about human rights, and they care about all the same things that you and I care about, putting a roof over their heads and putting food on their tables. But the CCP has decided that they pose a threat to what they would identify as their two core interests, which are maintaining internal stability and safeguarding their own sovereignty. Their foreign policy, the foreign policy of the CCP, is very insular. And they have said that Uyghurs, simply on the basis of being Muslim, are extremist. In some cases, they accuse them of being terrorists. But there's very little evidence to support that. And that line is something that the CCP has continued to tout. And they have used it wrongly to justify, as you all have said, what the U.S. government has deemed to be not just past and historical genocide and crimes against humanity, but ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity. These are, atrocity crimes of an epic scale. We know this from history, but many of us have thought, well, these types of crimes, they've been relegated to the history books, but no, they're happening here today. I think some of the best evidence for genocide and what you have to prove in order to meet a definition of genocide, and I'm sure you guys discussed this in your previous podcast, is the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part on the basis of like specific identifiers, including, most relevant to the Uyghur case, ethnicity and religion. And so you see the CCP's intent to do this in particular with their draconian birth control policies, where they are seeking to forcibly sterilize between 80 and 90% of Uyghur women of childbearing age in specific areas within Xinjiang. And so this is a genocide not only targeting current generations of Uyghurs, but it's making it so that they don't have a future either. And so I think I'll just pause there because I think that fact is really just pressing on the imagination that you would be eliminating future generations.
Yeah.
If I can go
So
back before we go forward. So
good.
the Uyghurs are basically a Turkic-speaking people, as I understand it. It's sort of a Turkish language group, and the region borders Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. But maybe before this wave of oppression happened, do you know approximately what was the population? What was the population in that region, and what percentage of that was Uyghur? Do we even know?
Those are hotly debated figures. The CCP, I think, says that there's around 13 million Uyghurs, but the Uyghur people believe that there's quite a lot more than that, actually, in actuality. And when you know what the total population size is, it makes it incredibly shocking that between 1.8 million to upwards of 3 million Uyghurs are held in political re-education camps. And, beyond that, I think there's like nearly 3 million Uyghurs that are subject to forced labor in various forms. And so when you put that in the context of like even just the CCP's estimates of the Uyghur population, it's vast in terms of sheer number, but also in terms of like percentages of size of the population.
And compared to the overall population in this this western region of China that we're talking about, is it majority Uyghur or?
Yes, majority Uyghur. Some people call it Xinjiang. That's what the U.S.
Yeah.
government officially calls it, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Some people call it East Turkestan. It just depends on who you talk with. But yes, that is just for that region. And one of the really interesting facets of the current persecution of Uyghurs is that the CCP has sought to bring the Han majority, which makes up the majority of China, to come in and essentially occupy or colonize this region as well. And so they have a policy that they call quartering, which I know in the US has very like military or specific contexts. But what it means in reality for Uyghur people is like a Han Chinese man will come in and live in the family unit inside of the home. I can't imagine as a woman how unbelievably threatening that would feel to have a complete stranger living there, not just with me, but with
Armed.
my children. I think that would just be so, incredible. And we don't have exact statistics on this, but you have to imagine that various forms of sexual abuse, including like rape and otherwise, are occurring in these contexts. And so it's just another form of subjugation that the CCP is engaging in. And I would say, like, when we think about this policy, obviously it's egregious, but it's a part of a broader theme where the CCP is seeking to tear apart the Uyghur family unit limb by limb. And you see this not only through the quartering, but also through the fact that parents are being separated from children when they're sent to the camps. They're also separated from their children when they're sent to labor abroad or excuse me, to labor in other parts of China, because not all of them just get sent to the camps. Some get sent to other parts of China purely for the purposes of forced labor. And then children themselves, too, are sent to so-called live-in kindergartens. Adrian Zenz, a scholar at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, has done fabulous research on this, where children are separated from their families, sent to so-called live-in kindergartens, and forced to become good members of the party, separated from their religion, from their culture, and from their family. And so this is very intentional. I don't think we should be under any illusions here. The CCP has the intent to destroy even the Uyghur family unit. Even if people are continuing to live, they're living apart from their norms and values.
So let's take a second here. I know we want to get back to the specifics of all the different, or at least some of the different, there are too many of them, atrocities that are going on here. But what you're describing is an attempt by the Communist Party of China to basically wipe out an ethnicity, culture, religious group. The first question that pops to mind for me is why? Do we know why the Chinese are doing this?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. And to me, it comes down to this notion that the CCP think that it harms their core interests. There's a fabulous book called China's Search for Security by Andrew Nathan and Andrew Scobell. And when they look at China's core foreign policy interests, they are often touching on the issues that the US government deems as like secondary, like Hong Kong. I mean, Taiwan has become increasingly important these days, but was not for a very long time. Tibet, and then, of course, Xinjiang. And the reason is because these groups are different. A lot of them seek to have a semi-autonomous life separate from the strong arm of the CCP, and that's seen as inherently destabilizing. And so the CCP targets them on that basis. The CCP has also looked at historical unrest that has been as a result of previous persecution. I know we are very focused on the modern, ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity, but the CCP has targeted Uyghurs for years, like collecting their DNA, destroying mosques, forcibly relocating people. When I speak with Uyghurs, most of the time I'm wanting to discuss the current context, but they tell me, Olivia, we've been called in repeatedly to be interrogated at a police station. We've been called in repeatedly and jailed for short periods of time, and we've been given no reason as to why this has been done. And this was happening long before 2016, when all of this, much, much, much more stringent campaign under Xi Jinping is happening. So I think there are many answers to your very important question, Brian. But I think that there can be no doubt that Xi Jinping, in his effort to secure and safeguard the party's power, has sought to tamp down and quell any forms of dissent. And one of the means that they have done so is not, exclusively against the Uyghurs, but against religious believers in general, because we've seen a huge crackdown when it comes to religious freedom, because at the end of the day, the CCP is okay with you practicing your religion so long as it's subservient to the party. And as somebody who is a Christian and a person of faith, for me, practicing something of my faith that would be like subservient to the government is not me being able to freely practice my faith. So I definitely find that to be just incredibly oppressive, regardless of the faith
tradition. Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
You're muted, Brian. Can I follow up, though? So it's interesting that you mentioned the religious faith part. And I want to ask you something that's important to me. I traveled to China, I think 7 times. Each time I went to Xi'an for part of that with groups of students. And the first time I went, I was stunned because I had no idea that there was any significant Muslim population in China at all. Xi'an is an ancient city and an old capital city of China, and right in the dead center of this, in the center of Xi'an, is the large Muslim quarter. I don't know if you've been there, Olivia, and in the center of that Muslim quarter is a mosque, the oldest building of which, and the doors were carved when Muhammad still walked the earth. It is ancient, and during even the tumult and all of the destruction during the Cultural Revolution, uh, the party didn't allow any attacks on that mosque, um, and practicing Muslims are everywhere in that Muslim quarter. The mosque is very well attended. Besides being a beautiful and peaceful spot,
Yeah.
uh, at least until the last time I was there, there's a large Muslim, practicing Muslim population in
Yeah.
Xi'an. And to my understanding, but maybe I'm wrong, there has not been a significant crackdown against them. But that's part of my question: is that a false impression? Because among the Chinese students that we interacted with, um, some of the, well, let's just say, um, um, unsavory attitudes were quite evident that the Muslim students in the group that we interacted with, a lot of just wildly disrespected in terms of their, food needs, their dietary needs, and indeed their need to pray during the calls to prayer. Really, some disturbing sort of attitudes from otherwise very worldly students. But I'm just wondering, what is the situation with the Muslim population in Xi'an, if you know, and elsewhere in China? In other words, is it specifically the Uyghurs who are targeted, which suggests it's less about Islam than
Yeah.
it is about something else?
Yes, so Uyghurs do face more intense persecution than other Muslim groups in China. I can't speak specifically to the situation in Xi'an, but I do know that, for example, there's another Muslim group called the Hui Muslims,
Mm.
and they have not faced as severe of persecution. Some of the reasoning given for this has been because Hui Muslims are predominantly Han, which is again the majority. Although I will say, I teach a class at Georgetown on countering authoritarianism in China or in Asia in general, and one of my students this year devoted her final research paper to looking at how the CCP's relationship to Hui Muslims is changing, and she was finding that there were some hallmarks of what has happened historically to Uyghurs now starting to ramp up against the Hui Muslims as well. And so I think actually, the Uyghurs are a cautionary tale for other groups, Muslim or otherwise. And we've also found, again, Adrian Zenz did fabulous research on this, that many of the same tactics that were used to subjugate Tibetans have been copied and pasted and used in the context of Uyghurs. So I think if you are a member of a group that the CCP deems as threatening to stability, as threatening to sovereignty, they will use very typical plays out of the playbook. And I want to be abundantly clear about what playbook that is. Like, it is absolutely a communist playbook.
Yeah.
There are some things that you see that are similar to what has been used in the Soviet Union before. Like, if you look and you read through history, you will find that this is not happening in isolation, of kind of a broader ideology here, and the CCP is truly bringing that to bear in the present context.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Re-education camps, taking kids away, all sorts of things like that.
Yes.
So a quick follow-up on something you said, and then I want to go into some specifics. This policy has existed before the current government, but from what you're saying, it sounds like Xi has made it worse with personal power.
Definitely made it worse. I think there's a broad consensus that Xi Jinping is, among the more brutal leaders, of the CCP historically.
Which is
You
saying
see,
something.
which is saying a lot. And I mean,
Saying a
a
lot.
lot of what he is doing, again, we said all of this is not happening in isolation. There are some similarities to even Mao-like policies as well. And I know those have resonance in the US too. By the way, I'm sorry if you're hearing my little one in the background.
That's a feature, not a flaw.
We're wondering what was happening at your house. All right, on a slightly different subject.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I think we could go on for 2 or 3 hours talking about the atrocities being committed. I want to put it to you in a slightly different way. You know a lot of Uyghurs, and we do not. From their perspective, what do you think the 2 or 3, and I won't limit you there, but what do you think some of the worst offenses to their daily lives are? How is this affecting them in the worst ways?
Wow. I feel that there are so many, ways that I could go into this. For my Uyghur friends here in the US, and I would imagine also for Uyghurs that are still behind in China, it's the separation of the family that is the most heartbreaking element of all of this. The CCP has done this in a variety of forms, but I have a dear friend whose mom has been held for over 7 years. Her name is Gulshan Abbas. And my friend's name is Ziba. And, Ziba has a sweet daughter who's very young, and she has never known the hug of her grandmother because she's been separated. And that is just so unjust. And she's an American citizen, Ziba is, and this is a family member of hers. So to be separated and to feel helpless, that the U.S. government is not able to secure her mom's release is just tough every day. Psychologically, that's tough. Emotionally, that's tough. So at the very human root level, I would say that would be one of them. I think the camps are obviously the most harrowing, just on an international scale. We've talked about the camps vaguely, but just to put a little bit finer of a point on it, people sent to the camps are obviously there to be reeducated. They want them to become good members of the party, forsaking elements of their identity that make them uniquely Uyghur. That means no speaking Uyghur language, learning Mandarin, learning the precepts of the party, etc. And these aren't just done in school formats. The CCP has tried to make it sound like, oh, it's just school. You're just going for higher education. No, that's not the case. When you read the harrowing accounts of people who have survived the camps and been released from the camps, they talk about rape and forms of sexual violence. The BBC's coverage of Tursun Isaiah Wooden's case, for example, is just, I recommend it to everyone. And she describes it as the camp setting is designed to destroy everyone's spirits.
Yeah.
The destruction of a spirit is taking away somebody's spirit is the most inhumane thing that you can really do. Uyghurs die in the camps. A lot of the women in particular are injected with unknown substances that result in their sterilization. And some folks at various points in the camps have been subject to forced labor, and then others outside have been subject to other forms of forced labor. And I would say that's probably my third point, is that the forced labor is not only egregious from the fact that no human being should be enslaved. It's egregious because many of them are being separated from their families too and from their culture. So that would be my answer.
It's just horrific. I think you had mentioned you have a friend that we've talked to, Qelbinur, and that she did a videotape for you. We're going to drop a clip of that in, but maybe you could introduce it first and tell us what's happening here.
Yeah, Qelbinur Aini is just an incredibly brave young woman. She lives in the DC area and has a family of her own, but she's separated from her sister who was left behind in Xinjiang. And her sister has been just subject to everything that we've discussed today. And, I know she will share in her own words what that's like, but she is a tireless advocate for the Uyghur cause and for the release of her sister Renagul. And her story is one that is so worthy to be told. So I'm really glad that you guys are featuring it here on the podcast.
All right, thanks. Let's play that tape.
I am Qelbinur, currently living in Virginia, Northern Virginia, which is in Fairfax. My sister Renagul Aini, She was a teacher, art teacher, and literature teacher when she was detained to mass concentration camp by Chinese government in 2018. She had 2 degrees, art and literature, and when she was detained, there wasn't any excuses given to my family, or there wasn't any trial for the first few years. And here is my sister photo. This is my sister photo, and she was born 1981, and she had 2 sons, and she was teacher, and she was eldest in our family. And this is her Chinese ID. And this is her youngest son. And this is what I had from the latest photos. And this is my last photo with my sister when I was visit my home in 2016 during the school holiday. And she was detained to this mass concentration camp in our local county, which is called in Chinese Qimuxian, reeducation camp in Uyghur language, or in English called Cherjian County Reeducation Center by officials. And she stayed in here from 2018 August to until 2021 May. I got to my sister detention actually the information in 2019. Since on actually I started giving testimonies to media, social media, media like Washington Post, Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and New York Times. And also I started to campaign in my social media like Twitter account, Facebook, including Instagram. This 5 years journey since 2019 wasn't easy. Since I started to speak up, I had gone through so many threatened messages from the Chinese government, like directly and indirectly. Directly is like they call my WeChat, because that's the only the tools that I could contact with my family. And indirectly is like they always visit my mom, threat her, harass her, and then always ask her to speak to me, to silence me. They threatened me they threatened me use my mom and my sister. Once they told me, your sister in our hand, your mom is you in our hand. If you don't listen to us, if you don't delete your testimony videos from the Twitter, you will never ever gonna see your sister alive, or you'll never see your mom alive. I received such kind of a lot of threat messages since 2019 until last year, because I given a testimony to Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, and also given those national Chinese national security officers long messages, voice messages, and video calls to them. And also the Congress made Congress is passed the bill about the Chinese, especially the that bill name is like transnational repression, against the transnational repression, like for Uyghurs or Hong Kongers or Tibetans. So since on that threat was like lesser, but didn't stop until now. And about my sister, after she stayed in here 3 years, since 2018 to 2021, they transferred her to the Changji Second Women's Prison. which is location is, this is the Chinese name. Sorry, I didn't translate to the English yet. The calls in English, Changji Second Women's Prison. This is I got from the Chinese officials where she was transferred. Before than that, they told me that if I listen to them, if I keep silent, they will release her. I keep silence like 6 months, but instead of she released, but she transferred to this biggest, one of the biggest prison in the Uyghur region. And later on, like I tried to search about this Chinese, this Changji Second Women's Prison, and I found out in this prison address there is another clothing factory registered under this address. And also I heard from my family since like last year, I guess, they allowed to my sister to like speak like 5 minutes every month, like in video calls. So she told our family, I am making dress every day. So if one day if I able to out of this prison, I will make you pretty dress. So, and this is what I found, that clothing factory address is registered under the prison, and my sister is making clothes. This is really unacceptable. Since 2019, I am seeking help. Not only me, thousands of Uyghurs like me, we giving testimonies, we speaking up, we protesting against the Chinese silent genocide towards the Uyghurs. And now Chinese government just like transferring our loved ones, our brothers, sisters, our parents from mass concentration camp to the prison and using them as a slave labor every day, and profiting from them like by selling these goods to free world like United States or Europe. And I hope first from the God, and then second after the God, I still hopeful from the democratic country like United States. I hope politicians will take some actual and some strong action against the Uyghur genocide, the silent Uyghur genocide, and then against the Uyghur forced labor. Chinese government didn't change anything, just they transferring our loved ones from mass concentration camps to the forced labor prison, using them as a slave labor, and then making money, and then sentencing them to long, very long sentence. My sister, sorry, I forgot to mention another key point is my sister was after the transfer to prison, they sentenced her to 17 years, 7 years for the praying at our father funeral, and additional 10 years for the keeping a religious book. This was informed our family verbally. There's no any trial or like there wasn't given any black white paper. So I still urge people in the free world, please take action, real action, toughest action against the Chinese government to stop this disgusting Uyghur forced labor and the silent Uyghur genocide.
Olivia, having watched Qelbinur's statement, I have two questions, really. One based on what you were talking about earlier, but I'll get to that in a moment. In terms of the forced labor in China, are there either specific concerns that the United States has, or things that the United States and others can do to influence the Chinese government to alter its behavior and to relieve the situation for the Uyghurs?
I think this genocide can often feel really far from home, as we've discussed earlier in the podcast. But the issue of forced labor brings it right to our backyards. Unfortunately, goods produced with Uyghur forced labor have made their way into US markets. And so that means that we have a responsibility, not just the US government, but also as consumers, to be very thoughtful about where we purchase from, that we are not inadvertently supporting the CCP in their efforts to subjugate the Uyghur people. But to that end, Congress, within a pretty close vicinity to the U.S. government's issuance of an atrocity determination, introduced legislation, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that was designed to effectively ban any goods produced with Uyghur forced labor from entering U.S. markets. That's the aim of the legislation. I'm not sure it's quite achieved that in reality yet.
How do you
So
implement that?
there's a lot
How
of
do you
work
enforce
to be
that?
done
Yeah.
on that. And I actually released a paper for Hudson to that end earlier this year, about 2 months ago, that goes into detail about how that law can be further strengthened so that we are not inadvertently funding the CCP's efforts to enslave the Uyghur people.
Do
But
we
there's a lot
know
more.
who the culprits on our end are? Like what sorts of products are we talking about that are sold on
I
Amazon?
mean,
Probably. Um,
products that you would be just absolutely shocked by. I mean, footwear and apparel is like, it's really common for the big names in footwear and apparel to be tainted with forced labor. The cotton, so like Shein and Temu, have come under a lot of fire. The select committee on the CCP in the US Congress, for example, put out a report saying, like, look, Shein and Temu are just egregious violators of UFLPA, and arguing that US policy should change and not give them preferences to be able to enter US markets here where American consumers are supporting, these terrible subjugation of the Uyghur people. Um, Even in your grocery store, unfortunately, sometimes you can find like Uyghur produced dates, tomatoes, and then a really like, this is a tough one because I know a lot of folks care about like climate issues and whatnot, but a lot of EVs, it's almost impossible to make electric vehicles without precursor items that are predominantly made in Xinjiang. And so this has become a very tough issue to deal with because it is affecting a wide variety of markets. And so I think as the UFLPA refines its efforts, we will likely find more sectors. Oh, and I just remembered one other, the seafood sector. Ian Urbina has done fabulous work, excuse me, looking at the seafood sector where there's Uyghur forced labor as well. So there's just many, many sectors are tainted.
So almost impossible to avoid, which means we need to publicize more and see if we can find ways to figure it out.
Exactly.
If I can change back to something that you mentioned before and that I hope will have an impact on people, we don't often get details about what happens to kids in these situations. We talk about the issues and people don't really understand them, I don't think. So we've got, starting with forced suppression of birth rates, but then family separations, children taking away from their parents and indoctrinated. Can you talk to us a little bit about the situation for families and kids and how bad that is?
Yeah. Well, I remember I have an 18-month-old son, and I was on maternity leave with him, and a video was released by Bitter Winter, which is a human rights advocacy website that I would highly commend to others. The video was of boys, I believe they were ages 5 to 9, and they were being interviewed by a member of the CCP. They asked them questions like, what do you want to be when you grow up? What's your biggest dream? Every single little boy said, I want to be a good member of the party and I want to grow up and join the People's Liberation Army. this is the extent to it. I felt like I was looking in my son's eyes, like every single Uyghur boy that I was looking at, I was like, oh my goodness, this could be my son. And I can't imagine my son, Noah, having his dreams essentially taken away from him, or the ability to dream curtailed and replaced with visions of the CCP and of any government for that matter. That's just not that's not what a kid should be dreaming about. And I feel like those videos really exemplify just the extent to which the CCP will go to brainwash and propagandize at the party's behest. So it's separation of families. It's undermining of trust in the values and in the religion and in what their parents would teach them, and replacing parents with the government, replacing trust with that would normally exist in a family context with the government. It's just very concerning. And so those are, I already, kind of went into the different ways that families are separated, the camps, through the forced labor transfer programs and through the so-called live-in kindergartens. But I think, those are the means that the CCP are using to separate families, but the tactics are really personal, at that. Like, if you get kids at that young, at that malleable of an age, you're changing trajectories and outcomes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I mean, past things like this in many countries
Yeah.
have led to kids turning against their parents.
Yeah.
Are the kids typically allowed to go back to their families at some point, or are they taken into state care, or are they rehoused with other quote unquote loyal families? What's that like?
So, as I understand it, a lot of them are returned, but because a lot of their family members are in camps, because they're, if they're being taken, they're generally from a family that's like, suspect or something. And so I think a lot of times the kids are ending up back with the grandparents, as I understand it. But the grandparents are elderly. What happens when they pass away?
Yeah.
These sorts of things are big, big question marks in my mind. And I honestly think, Brian, this would be an area that would be worthy of more research. Like, what happens when the kids are done with the boarding schools? And that's not something that I have the answer to, unfortunately.
It's probably more of a comment than a question, but maybe you can respond. This is at least the third wave of massive re-education, family separation, relocation that the Chinese Communist Party has carried out against its own population. The first in the years right after the revolution, kind of during and right after the Civil War, and then during the Cultural Revolution. And now we see the same thing. So they I hate to use the phrase, but they're really good at it. They have a lot of experience with it. And particularly in the Cultural Revolution, the separations and the problems with the children that Brian so nicely focused on was two ways. Sometimes the kids were taken to re-education camps. But if you've ever read Son of the Revolution, which was a wonderful but really terrifying story of through the eyes of a child during the Cultural Revolution, he wasn't taken, but both of his parents were. And so, but he was left during the Cultural Revolution, essentially left to fend for himself. But that meant he was sort of re-educated without being moved at one point, because he didn't have his parents there. But it's all, I can almost picture what these camps are like today based on the vivid descriptions of the first two waves in that book. And so I wonder if there are stories about the impact that would respond to what Brian just asked based on those earlier waves. But you're right, like it's just so destructive of a whole generation, and that this is now at least the third time that China's done this. Is really shocking.
So, I don't know that I'll be able to answer all of your specific and very historically rooted questions, but I will say that one of the questions that I get really commonly is like, how do we know that this is actually happening? And, there has been truly ingenious and incredible work done um, to document this crisis. And, we're lucky. I mean, you guys are getting firsthand views from Qelbinur, who is a survivor in her own right. But you've had incredible work done by the New York Times, by BuzzFeed, by other independent organizations to actually show in satellite imagery the existence of these camps, and then to interview and to back those
Incredible
up.
geographic expanse too. It is not small.
No, and it's the
Enormous.
camps were built overnight. Like if
Yeah.
a lot of times they
Yeah.
will do side by side satellite imagery, and this will have been like just completely raised ground.
Like
And
they
within
dropped
6
them down
months,
prefab or something. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
within 6 months,
Yeah.
it's a massive,
Yeah.
massive camp. And over time, you'll see the expansion of it. You'll see areas where they're able to then more precisely estimate like the number of individuals that could be held inside of each of these like different cells, units, etc. And I think it is incredible that technology has been able to aid us so much in being able to understand this crisis and to, I think, convince naysayers in many different ways, because the firsthand testimonies hit you at the heart level, but the satellite imagery hits you at like the intellectual level. And I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One thing I'm curious about is are we seeing a significant decline in Uyghur population, and is that depopulating the area, or are Han people being moved in to build that back up again? Because we're talking about it, first as a place of forced labor and where there's a lot of goods coming out of it, but also the idea that some village birth rates are down 80 to 100%. So how do those two things go together? The Chinese government keeping the area population up?
So Adrian Zenz has done really good research on this, and I don't recall the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there's been a radical decrease in the rate of growth in the population for precisely the reasons that you were saying. One of the tougher statistics to get our hands on, and I think this is true in any sort of massive crisis situation, is that unfortunately sometimes you don't know until afterwards, is the total number of people who have died as a consequence of the camps, right? And we know from like firsthand testimony that people are released and within months of release they die. We don't know how many people have died just like in the context of the camps. And so I think, again, this is an area for further research and for investigation. But I think regardless of the sheer numbers, the US government has such a responsibility to act, to not only hold like the Chinese Communist Party accountable through maximum like sanctions measures and otherwise, to hold those individuals directly to account for what they've done, but also to offer safe haven to people who have been able to flee. That means extending things like priority to refugee status to Uyghurs who could be resettled at a much faster rate than they are. You would not believe the number of Uyghur friends, including camp survivors, who still have pending asylum cases even after they've gone through these atrocities. That should be like the last thing that they're having to worry about. And so I think if, folks are sitting around and wondering, like, is there anything that we can do? There's so much that can be done. And so I think, beyond sanctions, beyond refugee relief, the work on forced labor is almost endless. There's just, I don't know why every single meeting with between U.S. and Chinese counterparts, there isn't a request for the camps to be closed and for every single person to be released. That just is so appalling to me, honestly.
Yeah, unfortunately, having some history with the way those things work at the State Department and in other places in the U.S., there are other priorities.
Right.
And this one can't be seen to overwhelm the more important trade things and other stuff that's going on. And we hear that all the time.
And that for me has been one of the key motivations behind my own work. As Joel mentioned at the beginning, I work broadly on human rights issues in Asia, and I try my darndest to make the security-based, the interest-based case for why human rights should be a component of broader US strategy, and why we're leaving critical elements on the table when it comes to negotiations when we refuse to integrate human rights into those other priorities. And, I think for me, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, if persecuting persons in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang are a top foreign policy priority for the CCP, why wouldn't it be a top foreign policy priority for the US to combat those efforts and to undermine what the CCP views as their core interests? That still baffles me. And so I feel like for me, I take that as a challenge. And I often will say that to other folks. I run a China human rights working group. And I just say that, like, we have to be thinking about ways to speak in a language that folks in State Department or in DOD or other places can understand and appreciate, not just the gravity or whether it's right or wrong to do something, but the strategic interests of engaging on these issues.
Well, that's really,
and I will
I was
speak to
going to
direct.
ask.
We real quick, on a follow up there, and just a statement directly to that point. This is one of the reasons why we do this podcast and teach and other things, because part of the answer to your question is there's no constituency for the Uyghurs inside the United States, and we need to build awareness to build a constituency. Yes. And that's an incredibly important piece of this. So your work there and coming on, appreciate you joining us for that reason. I'm sorry, Joel, let you finish up here.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you could maybe do two things. First, there's going to be a new administration one way or another in January. And is there something specific that you would suggest that administration do to try to have an impact on this situation? And then it's probably tied to that, but if you could talk a little, like if anyone asked me what my book was going to be about when I was researching it, I would have punched them in the nose. But if you could tell us what your book's going to be, no, what exactly are you, what's the focus of your research, and maybe you can talk a little bit about your current research project.
Yeah, absolutely. So to your first question, if there was one thing that either a Trump or a Harris administration could do that in my mind would have the most tangible impact, it would be to extend priority to refugee status to Uyghurs. Because when you're in a situation where you can't fundamentally, or it has not yet fundamentally changed, like the CCP as a party, as a system, the most tangible way that you can offer relief and assistance is to provide an out for those who want to flee, and to make it easier for them to do so in a way that is safe and stringent, still has vetting and everything, but that makes it so that they can come and advocate here for their cause. I know I've mentioned throughout this podcast, but I feel almost selfish that, like, I do all of this work that is really hard, but I get to benefit from the incredible friendships and relationships that I have with other Uyghur people who have managed to make it to freedom. And there is truly nothing that is more enriching than that, if I'm being honest. So that would be my big ask to a Trump or Harris administration. There's so much else that could be done, but that's my I think probably number one ask on my work and on my book. So this book has been something that's been on my heart for a really long time, and the goals of the book are twofold. One, to humanize the Uyghur cause, to make it so that it is more relatable. I grew up in the Midwest, and when I go home, a lot of people have never heard of the Uyghur people, whereas here in DC, maybe it's a little bit more familiar. I want people to be able to say, not that they could never say, I didn't know that this was going on, that they could have personal impact. And so my goal is to highlight the individual stories of Uyghurs in a way that really illuminates the severity of the ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity. And then to end with a really strong call to action, not just for the US government, but for the international community and also for individuals, because I get asked all the time, what can I do as an individual in order to help the Uyghur people? And certainly befriending Uyghurs that have been resettled in your local community is one way that you can do that. But another way that you can do that is, actually there are quite a lot of like Uyghur orphans. And I think there's not a lot of awareness about that. And while parents could potentially come back, some may not. And so I think this is another potential area for people to be thinking about. So anyway, in short, the book seeks to humanize the Uyghur people and also seeks to offer practical, tangible ways that different actors can respond so that we're not just left heartbroken over what has happened to the Uyghur people, but folks are left equipped with the tools and the knowledge to be able to act.
Olivia Enos, thank you so much for joining us. I learned so much. We're going to have you back. This is a huge issue. There's so many aspects to this that we could address and need to. Maybe once we know what kind of administration we're going to have in January, good luck with the opening up to more refugees. But I agree with you.
I think that might be working on that till I die. We'll see.
Yeah, maybe. I hope not.
It'd be a long time. And thank you also for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Andy Miles, for producing this episode of the World Discord podcast. Please like it, follow, subscribe, share. And as always, we're eager to hear your comments and suggestions for topics to cover. So thank you, and until next time.